Hello, guys, and welcome to this episode of the FLIx show that we're really excited to have. We have two guests today from India, and I would love to invite them to introduce themselves. We're really privileged to have them on the show today to really get a sense of how COVID-19 is impacting on the ground in India, how the government is responding at different levels, and yeah. So, Shruti, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Margaret. And great to see all of you. My name is Shruti Pandey, and I call myself, the easiest way to describe myself is a wandering lawyer. And I really mean that. I really mean that. So I have had my, I'm still wondering what is it that I can do best as a lawyer. I think I have experimented with various approaches to lawyering, from being a litigation lawyer to being a legal journalist to being, I assisted the government of India in drafting a law, which was the National Health Bill, which I was hired, and I spent 2 years of my life just doing that. I was part of an international philanthropy where I was supporting the building bridges between law and civil society for 8 years. I have done trainings, capacity building of judges and lawyers. I've done writing on law, and basically all of those was trying to build bridges. And so I haven't been a mainstream lawyer ever. I've always been a lawyer sitting on the boundaries or standing on the boundaries and trying to push the boundaries. So, throughout I have worked on human rights issues. Currently, for last 2 years, I have been teaching at one of the law universities in the National Capital Region, I'm currently an associate professor and associate dean at the O.P. Jindal Global University in Sonipat, which is just outside Delhi. So that's what I do, and I continue to figure what next.
So humble, because you also did some landmark cases in human rights as well. You certainly have been in the core of practicing law. I wouldn't see you only on the fringes, but you have one of these minds that is not contained by the law and the legal trajectory, but understanding the interconnections and the impact. So that's a very humble introduction, Shruti.
I did do a lot of public interest litigation cases in my litigation years. They led me out of litigation, unfortunately, as PIL went through its own downslide. But yes, it was a group effort, but I did lead some of those PILs.
And I really feel akin to you on that, because my background was public interest litigation as well, and that led me into public procurement, anti-corruption, and governance. So yeah,
wow.
so yeah, great. Sandeep, maybe you could introduce yourself.
Thank you, Margaret. My name is Sandeep Narwani. I'm a legislative advisor to the government of Delhi and the Aam Aadmi Party. I have been an activist for most of my life, though I did study law, and I wanted to fight human rights cases. Very soon in the game, I realized that human rights cases take decades to complete and to bear fruit. So I quickly jumped on to working on educational issues. And then one fine day, with a bunch of other activists, I was a part of the founding team of the Aam Aadmi Party. The Aam Aadmi Party miraculously came into power in its very first election, after fighting its very first election in the state of Delhi. Ever since then, it's been a blended mix of politics and policy for me. And this time around, we've just won our third election this last month, and my intention is to focus more on what happens in the parliament, what happens on the legislative front, because policies as such are very wide gamut, and it starts right from water policy and ends at solid waste and everything else in between. I wanted to focus more on how do parliamentarians can be optimized in their social impact, and how can you make the most of the opportunity of representing millions of people. So that's my story.
I wanted to get an idea from both of you of what it's like on the ground in India, because a lot of people are remarking, and they find it absolutely amazing that a country of over 1 billion people, um, the case of, as far as COVID goes, the infection rate is so low comparatively to, say, like the United States, and the death toll is so low as well. I just wanted to get an idea of what that feels like day to day on the ground in India.
Shruti, please go first.
Okay, thank you. So, Jessica, one is not sure about these figures. Frankly, I am not sure about these figures. I mean, we know so little about corona, how it's spreading, how it claims, how it infects and who infects and who it doesn't infect. And so there are all kinds of conjectures that Indians are, more immune, or tropical countries with sunshine, all that, those conjectures aside, I think that I would have liked there to be more transparency about the figures. We don't know so the testing itself is poor, and we know that that's how you access, you get information about the number of people who are infected and the number of fatalities. So that's about just the data. I think the transparency about the data is something that I feel very unsure about. But apart from that, so that's one thing. So I am not very sure if we know the figures correctly, at least as far as I can see it. And I think that the government is controlling the data, and there could be underreporting. We also know that the testing kits are very, very few. I mean, the number of the population per testing kit is, we can see that itself tells a story. But how does it look on the ground? On the ground, what has been most troubling for all of us here is the fact that the lockdown. So the Indian government has been lauded for taking very swift and very strong steps, by announcing a nationwide lockdown, by swinging into action, by enforcing and all that. And so it's seen as, bold, but we have seen that lockdown has operated very selectively on the ground. There is the middle class and affluent classes that have escaped the brutality of lockdown. And life has really gone on, apart from just the inconvenience of the fact that we are indoors. But the poor people, and especially here, what is very, very important for us to understand, which is different for countries in Global South, India and other countries in the Global South, is the wide prevalence of informal economy. People living in informal work, and people in informal settlements, and homeless population, there was a sudden, cessation of work for them, loss of income, most of them were daily wagers who lost their income. The city basically shut its doors on them, turned its back on them. They were overnight turned into panhandlers from being hardworking people who lived, by their hard work. They were turned into panhandlers, and eventually civil society has taken the major part of feeding them, but a lot of people just fled the city, and that is going on. Where we saw that the government did not really take prompt steps, and just left people to their own devices, left civil society to deal with it in a major way. And for some reason, the resources from the government are very meager for just feeding the fleeing migrant population. And so one part is this, and the other part, which is really, and I'll stop there, we can talk more after Sandeep says this, so we can build on these two. The other part of it is not about COVID-19, but it is about how COVID-19 has become a pretext for the government to enforce very repressive laws. It's a classic case of how in the garb of handling a disaster, the government has actually resorting to repressive laws for detaining people in the name of law and order. As we talk, we know that especially people from minority communities and people who have been known to be dissenting or to be critical of the government are being arrested, including the chairperson of the Minority Commission of the State of Delhi.
Yeah.
So people who are speaking up or people who are asking for accountability are being arrested. And while world over, we know that the prisons should be actually eased at this moment because the incident, and today I was reading somewhere that 70% of the prison population in US, they've tested positive for corona. And in this situation, we are putting more people in the prison.
Yes.
So those two are very, very troubling parts for me. I am actually not so, I mean, these are really keeping me sleepless at night.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point, because one of the things we are looking at Future Law and the GCPR starting to go into is the relationship between the rule of law in a country and the effectiveness of their COVID-19 response. And we have just done a very simple correlation, and we'll share it with you at another time, between countries and their ranking on the rule of law index and the mortality rates in the country. And it's quite striking that there is a clear positive correlation between countries that rank high on the rule of law index and the mortality rates. And India, which ranks not as high on the rule of law index, is ranking very low on mortality rates. And what you've just said is adding a lot of context to that kind of data, because it may be that countries that are able to invoke more authoritarian and repressive measures are able to deal with the lockdown in a particular way. But I hear you on the point of statistics, and it's a point that we keep knocking up against, because that's another point about why some countries demonstrating low infection rates or low mortality rates. It could be a lack of transparency in their data, lack of effective mechanisms for collecting the stats, and so I think what you've done is really pointed us to a couple of areas that we must look at before you jump to certain types of correlations between rule of law and type of democratic society and the mortality rate. But I would like to bring Sandeep in to hear his perspective on what's going on the ground in COVID. And I know you've done some work with migrant workers and that sort of thing. You may be able to give that perspective as well, Sandeep.
Thanks, Margaret. I want to start by narrating a story. I want to narrate a story from a migrant worker who is working with a vegetable vendor in the center of Delhi, in the heart of Delhi. This man earns about 10,000 rupees a month, which is much less than the minimum wage. That's about 2/3 of the minimum wage in India, in Delhi in particular. And he started experiencing high fever, and there was very little help coming from local authorities, because he's actually living right next to his vegetable shop. He's a homeless person. Apart from being a migrant laborer, he's one of the millions of people in the city who are homeless. But I mean, they don't have any recognition on paper. They don't have any identity as for being homeless. And for 2 days, he was trying to get an ambulance, and he didn't get one. And after 2 days, somehow, some of his other colleagues got him in a taxi and took him to a hospital. The hospital charged him 4,500 rupees for a test. That's half his salary, half his month's salary went on the test. Then he had to come back and again sleep on the street for 2 days, because the test takes 48 hours for a result to come out. So for 2 days with high fever, he had to sleep on the street. After 2 days, he gets a result, and he's corona positive, and he's been diagnosed with corona. And then there's panic in that market. And the next thing is that 4 of his other colleagues also went to get themselves tested. They were all feeling feverish. They weren't asymptomatic cases, though India has a high number of asymptomatic cases as well. And all 4 of them have now been tested positive. So now there is there's extreme panic in that vegetable market. No one is going there to buy anything. No one's going there to sell anything either, because even the migrants are very scared. Migrant laborers are very scared of being diagnosed with corona, because the point over here is that people are scared of going to the hospitals, and this is the bigger challenge for us to understand. People hate going to the hospitals. They would rather stay out. They would rather go to a quack. But the entire healthcare system is so painful. I don't have to say much about it, because a lot has been documented. Like, waiting period is like an average waiting period is about 2 days to see a doctor. And during the corona crisis, other patients have been turned down. When I mean other patients diagnosed with anything else other than corona have been refused from hospitals, public hospitals and private hospitals. Now, when you look at society from the bottom of the pyramid, when you look at society from the last man's eyes, you will see how difficult it is to navigate the system and also survive through this lockdown. I mean, there are people who are at one stage who are unemployed or laid off, who can't find a daily wage. They are very restless to either get back to their homes in the villages so that they have some foods, there's something to eat, or else, start working again. Neither of it is happening right now because the borders are sealed. And the point that I'm trying to come to is that while we may not be testing patients, and our the number of corona patients is far less compared to America in terms of population, I still feel that the population in India is under far more distress than anywhere else in the world. I feel that the unrest and the suffering is something that we will have to find new indexes and new means to measure.
Mm. This actually brings a lot of systemic issues to our attention. I mean, I'm based in Slovenia, and we are still getting a lot of information about India. I mean, you do have quite a large population. You have 1.3 billions of people. So when India locked down, it was, there was never such a situation on a global scale where so many people at the same moment would be just locked down. And the whole economy on the global scale would be kind of stagnating and would be stopped just because we have to deal with the disease that spreads with incredible speed. So what I'm hearing from you both is that this is perhaps not even so much an issue that we are dealing just like from a healthcare point of view. It's really rooted in different domains, and we actually need to tackle it with a very systemic strategy. What I'm now asking you both is, since we are lacking a very good understanding of how we can even recognize the dynamics that we are having in our society, one question is, how do we build that kind of a systemic approach? How do we react when such crisis is challenging us to really understand well our society? Can we, like you were previously mentioning, Sandeep, that you are now creating these different categories, and you're marking different regions with different colors based on what affection rate they are having? And then the second question would be, how can we lawyers even help? Like, we're now having these GCPR sprints, and I mean, my understanding, and I'm still amazed by it, you always come towards us with new sets of laws and new sets of rules, and we have now been grasping 600 of these policies coming just from India. How can we even tackle that? Like, I mean, we are lawyers, and there is so many open questions.
So the number of laws and policies that are being launched in India is definitely spectacular. So we brought this current federal government to power because we were very unhappy. When I say we, I'm saying on behalf of Indians, that Indians brought this government to power because we felt that the earlier government was very weak and lazy, and they said that there was a policy paralysis. And so we wanted a government that is very up and about, and that is very active, and that is showing visible action on the ground. And so here comes a government that is for sure very, very strong, and they are. So someone last year said that they are bringing out laws like how the pizza delivery man gets your pizza. You know, it's like, yeah, we are getting laws delivered like pizza. And so that angst we had against the earlier government of, you know, policy paralysis is definitely been addressed by this government. But then what kind of policies, what is the content of those policies? And I think that Corona has, so just to remind you the background, just before Corona kind of sprang in our, you know, and kind of toppled our lives, we had the long agitation against the Constitution, the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was amending the Constitution which has amended the Constitution. It has already become a law. It was passed by the Parliament because they have a brute majority, remember? So it was passed to redefine citizenship in a very, very drastic way. And so we had a prolonged December onwards till January, February. We had you know, agitation citizens groups and you know, agitating against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And then we had riots that started happening. You know, in Delhi we had, in the capital city of India, we had riots, which was like absolutely rattling. And then Corona happened. So what we see is very interesting. You know, so you talked about systemic issues. I see that this really, really alerts us to the very tight connection between economic, social rights and civil political rights. Something that we keep forgetting. You know, we are so a strong government is often, you know, a government that shows its strength by, you know, being active in the CPRs and civil political rights space, and it looks strong, but by undermining the economic, social rights. So there is a bargaining, you know. So while the civil political rights, so people feel that, okay, the police is very strong and they are very up and about or active. But now we have, so this is a classic time for us to see on the ground how the two, and we have the UN High Commission for Human Rights has issued a statement against weaponizing the emergency powers in the wake of a health emergency to repress dissent and to repress criticism. So it will happen. It is bound to happen. We also know that there will be disaster capitalism that will kick in. And we know that these are right-wing authoritarian governments that will typically use these times to, you know, channelize funds into bigger, you know, corporations, but not help the small and medium-sized enterprises, which are completely losing. So right now, the big worry is that, you know, I mean, there is a lockdown. We have had 3 phases of lockdowns. I've stopped trying to understand how the changes are happening, because what is on paper, what is on ground are 2 different things. But we have had a police that has been there have been a huge alarming rise in the atrocities by the police on people who are found on the roads in the name of lockdown enforcement. We've had attacks on people from minority communities. We have had active denial of services to persons from minority communities. For example, people from a certain minority community are not being given admission in hospitals, or they are being we have had reports of Muslims not being given admissions in hospitals in certain cities. We have had a huge setback because one community was blamed for the spread of the coronavirus because there was a religious congregation. But we know that the religious congregations have happened for all communities. All communities have had religious, because while the news was still, you know, coming in, these congregations, I mean, they keep happening. So, but one community has been, you know, blamed for it.
I was about to ask about that scapegoating.
Right. And then the whole, you know, I mean, so the kind of threat perception of the people from that community is very, very high, and everybody is sitting on the edge right now. The sense of security is very, very low right now with the strong government that we have, and then I hope that we will, you know, the lesson about the absolutely inextricable connection between economic, social rights, civil, political rights is going to be learned by the citizens of India in this while this is going on,
and hopefully just for Sunday Chapter and also across the world, because that point that you've raised about the relationship with the civil and political rights and the economic, social, and cultural rights across the globe, countries have been accepting and ratifying and putting in place civil and political rights, but have been slower to adopt the economic, and is this an opportunity then, Shruti, for us as lawyers working in a collaborative together? Because Anya asked about the systemic, we have to look at this systemically, which I think is such a critical approach. And in your response, you brought to mind this, our international framework for recognition of rights, which is civil and political and economic, social, and cultural rights. And I'm saying that in countries across the globe, just as in India, there is a different approach to civil and political and economic and social and cultural rights. And you are saying that COVID and what is happening now is showing us how inextricably intertwined they are. So I am asking, is this therefore now an opportunity? Because in the GCPR project and at Future Law, we are so inspired by so many of the thinkers around history and trends. And Yuval Harari has really made the case for how this is an opportunity for us to reset, but it can go either way. And you have been pointing to that. It can go either way. So I'm saying the point that you raised about the intersectionality of these civil, political, and economic, social, and cultural rights, can we, as a collaborative of lawyers working worldwide, with the support of the UN and that framework, start to really create a stronger lobby for governments worldwide now to recognize this interconnection and to pass the laws in their countries that will recognize the primacy as well of economic, social, and cultural rights? Do you think we can get together and do something like that?
Yes, I think that the way we take positions on this is going to be very important, that we don't fragment our demands, our claims, that we don't compartmentalize ourselves, that we don't think through fragments of health rights separately, livelihood separately, income security separately, or for food security separately, or police and police violence, state terrorism. I think that we should be and also in the basis of that is how we document. So and I think as lawyers we are trained now. By now we are, so people on the ground, the civil society groups are already doing it, but they don't have the lens of the economic, social, political, that they are intertwined. They don't think we have the training to label them and also call out the fallacy in that label. So how do you label dignity? So today, when the migrant labor is being attacked on the road by the police, or is being stigmatized, or is being, so I don't know if you saw, there was a whole group of migrant workers who were walking, like they walked hundreds of kilometers, and you saw those images, but they were at some place, some smart, administrators sprayed them with insecticides. Or disinfectant. They were sprayed. They were just made to huddle together. It was heart wrenching. I mean, I could have died. It was just. I just didn't sleep that night. And so, incidentally, Sandeep told about a story. I have a personal story. The day the nationwide lockdown was being announced, I was on the road because I live in Delhi, and I have a sister who lives just in a sister town, city adjacent to Delhi, which is Noida, which is in another state. Delhi is a state and capital city. And then there are three states that border Delhi. And my sister lives in one of those cities. And my father lives with her. And he was taken critically ill, And he was very, very sick. And the message I got was that just come because he's not going to live. And I was, and I have contacts with police, senior police officers, lawyers, doctors, and I was calling everyone, as I just drove, asking them, tell me the protocol, tell me how does one do this in a legal way that I'm not defying it. I don't want to be violating laws, but I don't want to be stopped from seeing my father if he's going to. He finally had to be hospitalized. One hospital turned him away. They said, we are not taking any admissions. Then we took him to another, and of course we used our contacts, and then finally we got him in a hospital where we knew the owners. He was, all this while my sister's building was being sealed because somebody who was tested positive was in that building.
Oh my God.
I wrote about this in on my Facebook, that I could manage to, muscle my way through all that. I was dealing with Delhi police, I was dealing with Uttar Pradesh police, I was dealing with, all kinds of situations, the hospital authorities, the doctors, the nurses, and people like us who can speak English, who are visibly educated from a certain class. We are very, very privileged. I still was feeling extremely vulnerable. It was just my power that I pushed my way, muscled my way. But someone else, all that while, I just kept thinking, what would have happened for
the average person? Yeah.
How would they? And that is exactly so dignity, security, all of these are, and I think it is a very opportune moment for us to imagine how to make our how to call out violations where we don't fragment, and how to ask for our rights where we don't fragment.
But I think part of the answer to Shruti could be, and I share this deep connection with the suffering of people on the ground, people who don't have the access to the privilege that we have. But could part of the answer be forming alliances across borders? Because if we submit ourselves only to the sovereignty within our nation state, that political will, that power structure keeps us there. But what is the role of the UN in this? The UN needs to step up on this with the, all of the rights, and perhaps the UN can support coalitions of professionals in all the different sectors all over the world, and the UN can give us a support to leapfrog sometimes and to gain more power vis-a-vis our national representatives and all of that. So, yeah, I mean, what you're saying is really just stimulating so much about, as a lawyer, as you know, Shruti, we are just like, how can we help? What can we do to support those on the ground that don't have the support? So, yeah, yes.
I actually want to hear, because Sandeep previously said that he was and still is an activist. I do very much want to hear what's the role of an activist in all of this. Yes, there's a lot of laws being passed, and I'm hearing a lot of inequalities are being present, and we have not even been aware of all of them, or have been, but have been pushing them aside. Is the role of activists now being more imminent and more important than ever, or is it just like a constant battle that you've been having in your life?
Well, the way I look at it is that when there is a barrage of policies that comes our way as activists, we need to look at the policies that are for the poor, and then we probably then start analyzing them as activists and then start taking action. I feel that in the processes that we've been doing with the GCPR project for the India group, there have been a bunch of policies that are about travel norms and travel regulation, air travel regulations, which concern the rich. Most people in India would perhaps never sit in an aircraft. But coming to another dimension of food supplies, coming to another way of looking at how small shops would operate within the lockdown, I think this is where the role of activists becomes very prominent in democracy, because here they are trying to ensure that 80% of the population is still able to survive while the country is fixing its healthcare system. And I feel at that stage, again, like Shruti said, we try to compartmentalize lawyers. Likewise, we also started compartmentalizing activists. There are education activists, there are healthcare activists, and then there are people who are information activists now who fight for the right to information and privacy and so on. But this is the time for everyone to come together, because I think this is affecting us all with the same magnitude. So I would believe that as the activist community in India, the first week was just about regrouping, because we weren't able to make sense of the pandemic. It was happening to us in India. We never thought that this would perhaps spread the way it did. But now I feel that the movement is more about asking social welfare policies, and in its current form, maybe legal activists would be going to courts and fighting for those policies, then there would be a bunch of other people who would be doing things online and using social media networks to fundraise for the poor, for perhaps spreading more awareness. Then there are also activists who are working with the marginalized communities and ensuring that they get healthcare. For instance, I spoke about the man who got his test report after 2 days, and then everyone in his shop was also infected. Now, those guys were really fortunate because there were 3 activists who were supporting them and ensured that they got the test done for everyone else. They raised the money. By the way, I did a Google, I just did a Google, I just did a conversion. The amount of money required to do one test in a private hospital is $60 US. So getting 300 US for 5 migrant laborers must have been some task for those activists. And I think this is where they are very important cogs in the wheel. They are actually one of the reasons that the system can still function. Civil society is one of the reasons why there are hundreds of activists on the ground now distributing food, going from one slum to another, and ensuring that those who have been confined in these very, very small places with high population density do get 2 square meals. Because if these poor people who step out of their slums, like Shruti said, they'll be attacked by the police very brutally. So again, negotiating with the police is something that the activists can do, because they would perhaps have more knowledge of the law and would be visibly from another class. So I think if there's ever a time to get out of our comfort zones and to be serving society, this is it. Whether one considers themselves an activist or not, whether one likes the label on the head or not, it's a difficult label to wear in a right-wing world. But I feel that this is the time when we have to serve our people. Otherwise, this is a regret that we'll carry forever.
I have to comment. I mean, it sounds incredible what you're describing. In a way, I would have thought that a crisis is going to bring people together. And what you're describing is actually the opposite. Like, there's been even more differentiation and even more discrepancies between people. And, people are not being fed the same way. They are not having the same opportunities when it comes to the healthcare system. And we are only now actually realizing how we are not collaborating with each other. So I actually believe that if India succeeds, it's going to be a very good use case scenario for the global scale. We actually see the same happening between different jurisdictions, not only within India. Countries are now closing the borders, even though they have the capacity and even though they have the healthcare equipment. They are not sharing it with different jurisdictions because they first and foremost have to take care of their own citizens. And it seems to me as if, first and foremost, people need to take care of their own castes or their own families, their own people that are following them. And that's actually a huge issue to be addressed. It actually brings me down to, how do we build reputation in this world? How do we really bring the equalities into place?
I wanted to build on what Anya was saying, especially that last part with things becoming very localized, because you think of India and as a country, and it is huge, and even in little islands like mine where I live, you're seeing communities are starting to sort of rally within smaller groups and localized actions starting to be taken within those communities. Are you seeing that as well, where you have states within India and then smaller communities? Are you seeing independent grassroots organizing on that level, and less dependency on that higher chain and dependency at the federal level?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the only way out. There is very little possibility of a centralized command and control system over here, where food would come from one warehouse and be distributed to millions of people. Philanthropy and activism both has to be very local. I think organizing has been happening more through social media and through other creative means. People have been figuring out ways to donate, like, each house would perhaps donate 1 kg of rice, from middle class communities. And then, some people, some activists would be collecting it, and volunteers would be going around collecting that food, and then going and cooking it in somewhere in a safe place where there's social distancing is possible. Perhaps cooking in a local temple or a local, Sikh temple, which is called the Gurdwara, or any other community place for that matter. And then utilizing any open space to distribute the food, observing principles of social distancing. So I think all of that has actually made us very strong. I think a lot of communities have realized their responsibility like never before. But having said that, it can only happen in communities which are empowered or perhaps have the means to serve others. And that shows that there are silos of great projects going across the city. If you look at fundraising pages, fundraising campaigns happening, which are hyper local, absolutely hyper local, for like maybe for a city that has 20 million population, I have seen fundraising campaigns only for 10,000 people. Because there is a certain community which was relocated from one part of the city, from a slum. They were evicted from a slum and thrown to the outskirts of the city. So they have a fundraising campaign going on for them. But otherwise, apart from these small examples of which make us very hopeful about the future, local organizing has been limited to financial means. And I feel that, again, that throws us back to the state, our dependence on the state, that we are looking for some kind of monetary support or perhaps food supply support coming from a so-called abstract body of a state, which will, from somewhere there'll be a miracle, there'll be a truck coming in with loads of food grains in it, and some person's just going to be distributing it. And I think that is all because these are dynamic networks which are coming across, which are building as time goes on. They're developing it every day, but this is something that's still going to take time for us to really kind of crystallize these kind of networks for the future.
And I wanted to pivot on that a little bit, on looking at what the Indian government at the federal level is doing. I don't know if you have information based on the policies you've been collecting on what economic measures the Indian government are taking to try to relieve what's going on with its people, so that you see the US now is issuing a stipend of sort $1,200 to everyone. In many countries, support is going out to small businesses financially. And just a couple of days ago in Barbados, the Prime Minister of Barbados announced the issuing of government bonds, recession bonds, so that companies could buy, people who had the excess liquidity could buy those bonds, and government will then have more money now to reinvest into these social programs and social relief efforts. Can you give us any insight as to what the government of India is doing in economic measures and economic relief? Shruti or Sandeep?
Shruti, please take this one.
Thank you for raising this. So again, this economic packages is also it's an intervention where we have an opportunity to interrogate. What is it that we are asking for? What is it that will be really what will really make a difference to the people who are affected? And so so yes, we need wage subsidies, which has not been announced in India. We have basically, the government has said that, has basically asked for employers to be good employers and appeal to their humanism. But the government has not announced. The government has also not withdrawn commitments to, infrastructural projects, which were anyway looking very extravagant to us, building a new parliament or building, a new prime minister's office or house or whatever, huge expenses there, projects being cleared while this is happening, which are privileging the extractives. Yes. So that is all very murky, and in the middle of that, we are asking the government to tell us, how much food, how much money are they putting into food, distribution program. I think, and this is also, to speak to your earlier question about the role of lawyers. I think that, so first of all, as lawyers, one, that in this entire scenario, one big casualty has been in the area of access to justice. The Supreme Court has practically shut itself down. And and they're taking only urgent matters, and those urgent matters we have seen are very there is a very strange way of prioritizing cases. So the cases that are about which are about the most urgent issues are not really being prioritized. So under the lockdown, the withdrawal of the judiciary, even though we have technology, we have capacities in the system to do it, but for some reason the courts have withdrawn. As lawyers, as lawyers, I think there are huge opportunities, and this is this is about the work that I've been trying to build. About first of all, as lawyers, are we going to be stuck with this triad of court, judge, and law, lawyer, judge, and court? The law, court, and whatever, lawyer, court, and law. Are we as lawyers, are we really being our fullest? Are we able to be? Are we really being most effective? If we are, unless we go out of this comfort zone and move to the move outside the boundaries. So we have quarantined ourselves for decades, right? We have self-isolated ourselves in our whatever our professional pride or whatever we call it, but we have made ourselves believe that our workspace is the courtroom or the law space of law. But I think that this is a time for lawyers to become more collaborative again, to engage with other stakeholders, to learn, just to learn, and just to keep our eyes and ears open. I think that's one. The second part that I really think is important is that as lawyers, we are are we asking for these very humanistic reformist management kind of approaches, like compensatory redistribution kind of approaches, or are we asking for deeper systemic and structural change that is surfacing, the need for which is surfacing through this huge emergency? So are we just going to tinker at the surface by asking for welfareism at this moment? Of course we want. Of course, we want urgent, relief to be.
Yeah, but we also, it's both.
I was going to get into that, because India is a corporate hub. A lot of the multinational corporations are based there, and a lot of multinational corporations depend on India for various resources, from human resources to mineral resources. I'm wondering, and we've been speaking to the public sector, what regulation of the private sector is there to wield the revenue they produce, the profits they produce in favor of the population that they depend on and the country that they depend on to make those profits? Is there any of that happening?
No, I think contrary. I think it is, the big corporations which had gone into, had already been in the red because of their mismanagement or because of their dishonesties or malpractices, are now being bailed out under the emergency powers, And so again, the government is misusing this opportunity to privilege them. Even though, there has to be accountability by them. So we know that, by now we know, so between this hyper local, between being stuck with this absolutely hyper local, that right now I'm stuck in my home. So I am so hyper localized. At the same time, we have never been so global. So this whole, the fact that we are in this dichotomy of hyper local and global is telling us something. I think that today we are united by the crisis of. It's clear. I remember a student asking me, "Are you a leftist?" Almost like accusing. But we know that there is, whatever that alternative is, and this is again, I was reading Roberto Unger's work, where he talks about this dictatorship of no alternatives. So where he says that we have kind of grown, we have kind of resigned ourselves to just this or that, either you, so if you don't have capitalism, you have to have socialism. And we know how people in the how people in certain parts of the world kind of panic if you say capitalism has to go, they just think that, oh God, you are a communist, and so this labeling of another extreme. So he talks about how this dictatorship of no alternatives has to be challenged, and he talks about how there are the illusions of false necessities, where he says that we have, so he talks about, deeper transformation so he talks about how there has to be an imagination beyond these labels.
Yes.
And so this is, if we don't do it now, when will we do it?
Yeah. And this is
telling us that we have become like absolutely run away with our, like instant gratification, desires and aspirations. And we are on a suicide path now as a collective humanity. We all will sink together. And so if this is not going to tell us, something, if this is not going to, prod us to think of, imagine something beyond what we've all. And so he talks about how there can be, how change can be, how an alternative can be experimentally imagined. So, but the integrity behind that imagination has to be there. And we have, before we ask for that integrity from the establishment, we have to have that integrity with ourselves, within ourselves. What is it that we are asking for? As lawyers, what is it that we are imagining ourselves as, what is the success that we imagine, of our own selves as lawyers? So this whole, I think we have to move beyond what are, very comfortable kind of solutions, which are basically just tinkering on the surface, to really do unpleasant, deeper digging and structural and systemic engagements. And I think this conversation is part of that. We have to keep refining our own thinking before we, get out of our comfort space.
Shruti, you are, you're preaching to us here, and we, no, that came out wrong. I'm saying, I feel like I want to sign up for your church. You understand what I'm saying? But the point I'm making is this: what you've identified, and then referring to Robert's work with dictatorships of no alternatives, like Margaret Thatcher was, there is no alternative to neoliberalism, and this sort of thinking where it's either one alternative or the other. You are pointing us to what we refer to in Fiji as a complex approach, understanding the complexity that exists in the system, and holding the tension between this hyperlocal and the global at the same time. And how do we, create this deeper systemic and structural change? And so I'm really excited about the conversation we've started having with you today, Shruti and Sandeep, on these issues, and the thoughts that you're already starting to inspire. And I'm hoping that we can continue to work together in GCPR, the project, and as a collaborative to really answer that question that you just posed. And I love the idea of leaving that question, what really is the deeper systemic and structural change we as lawyers can come together to try to agitate or work for. That's a question I would love to work with you on going forward.
We cannot complete this conversation without flagging gender.
Okay.
So the huge rise in gender violence all over, in especially domestic violence. And so the masculinity of our imagination itself, So I wrote, I have overnight become a poet, in these weeks. I wrote a poem where I said, is the lockdown a man or a woman? Is the lockdown a masculine? Just like we ask ourselves whether law is a man or a woman. I asked, if the lockdown is a man or a woman. And so the ethics of this transformation, what is the transformation we imagine, and then how is it how is it connected with the gendering of our imagination, is something that I want to talk about. And so this whole the UN chief saying that ceasefire in domestic violence, I called out, and the men didn't get it, So sorry, I mean the men meaning the men who are patriarchal men, not the sensitive men like our friend here. So, but I think that, calling for a ceasefire on domestic violence was such and this is like treating the home as a war zone, treating domestic violence as a two-way conflict. And what does he mean? Like after the corona, COVID recedes, we can go back to warring, not recognizing the aggressor, not recognizing that there is a power play there, and talking, and very patronizingly saying ceasefire. Okay, children don't fight. So I think that kind of, so that there is a gendering that as women we have to call out, because I think we understand this. And all the people who are fighting against patriarchy, including Sandeep.
Thank you for raising that up. Just to say that I actually believe that should be a topic for like a separate discussion. It's a huge issue.
And we would love to hear your perspective, Shruti, because we're having the same issue in the Caribbean. There's been a spike in domestic violence all through the Caribbean, Latin America as well. And you speak of the COVID being used as the pretext to enforce authoritarianism, and that lockdown has become a means to enforce a certain level of authoritarianism within the home for a lot of women and their freedom and their ability to move around, as well as for children as well. So, and we can't neglect the fact that men are also abused in abusive situations as well. And many of the outlets perhaps that men were using outside of the home to release a lot of stress and so forth are no more available to them. So they're bringing that into the home. So that's something we need to explore.
Not just men, women, I think we should recognize the fluidity, the gender fluidity. This is a great time to recognize the fluidity of gender and call out patriarchy. The last thing I wanted to just flag, just so that we don't leave it out, I want to put it on table, is the surveillance, So Indian government has launched with a lot of fanfare and a lot of, noise, an app which is going to, help me keep track of how I don't get infected. And this is highly, highly troubling. Of course, I've not signed up for it. Of course, I don't trust that app, because that is surveillance at its classic, and we know already that people have been identified, named, their names have been made public because they were in a certain location, and they just assume that this person is, and then the person is being attacked. But also, so I read horrific things about how over the skin surveillance and under the skin surveillance. I mean, I'm appalled by the kind of misuse of technology to enter my life and surveil me is threatening to do that a lot. In India, it is already happening. So I just
we see that on. I mean, these are two very important topics. I'm so glad that you raised them up. We've saw. Like Jessica, what you were mentioning, our country is not really perceived to have a lot of domestic violence, but we have seen a lot, like the spike as well. This is why we've instantly created a call center so that people can call there and report these issues. We've also seen that in China and a lot of Asian countries, there's been a lot of files for divorces. All of a sudden, when people are brought and locked down together, they are actually figuring out that perhaps they're not really meant for each other. So those are all the things that we could sum up in one conversation. And the surveillance, I mean, I love it. We already had people that were approaching our group and the GCPR sprints telling us that they would actually like to focus rather on the jurisdiction to the topic of surveillance. The MIT is actually, and privacy, it goes hand in hand, absolutely. The MIT is focusing on privacy rules and how can we actually create privacy by design. There is also a huge collaboration that I'm engaged with applications and developers that are trying to create decentralized solutions so that we don't really provide governments and central authorities with the ability to track us down and to kind of make the stigma on our identities, just like you mentioned. If my name goes public and everybody knows that I was infected with that disease, I mean, that's going to be a very huge social issue. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I'm more than willing to actually schedule more calls, perhaps even have like a panel discussion with a lot of these experts. I would love to hear more of your opinion because you come from the human rights perspective, and you as a lawyer have a very good understanding of how this affects a person and our rights. So our rights are constantly just being...
The stigma, it seems that we have to address stigma. What
Yeah,
Sandeep
yeah.
said about one person testing positive, and the stigma alone, just the fear alone of it, just being spread, you know, an irrational fear. The same thing had to happen during the AIDS and HIV crisis, telling people how you contract it, you can't contract it through this, you can't contract it through that. And I think it's harder now because we know so little. We're still in the early stages of this. And it seems to be changing all the time. The symptoms seem to be changing. New symptoms seem to be popping up. I was reading something on COVID toes. There's some new symptom where they're observing there's a way the toes look and bruising around the toes. New things are coming up all the time. So there may be need in the future for a anti-stigma campaign for coronavirus.
There's already Yellow Canary. It's actually a project that won the European versus Virus Hackathon. It's a broader collection of all the people that are actually fighting these stigmas as well, and are trying to help people going through psychological issues that we are now dealing with during the crisis time. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that we should discuss, and I'm very happy that you guys are joining us for the GCPR and monthly meeting, because I think that the feedback loops that we have created through those sprints are going to bring a lot of learnings in the future. And perhaps this is actually the new type of legal collaboration that we are creating here.
That's right.
The feedback loops, the blogging that we can do together, the PRing that we can do together. I mean, we are covering so many different domains.
And litigation, we could
and
possibly on lobbying, legislative lobbying. You know?
Yeah.
I do.
So, yeah.
And one of the things we're asking all of our experts at the end is, yes, COVID is an opportunity for a reset. And we're asking 3 questions. What do you think we need to stop doing? What do we need to keep doing that we're already getting right? And what do we need to start doing in order to seize the opportunity that COVID presents to create and enable the emergence of a safer, more just, and ecological resilient world, you know? So
if I was to give an answer from my personal perspective, we need to start thinking of a new world. I feel this is the time when we start envisioning a new healthcare system for a country like India. We start thinking of a new judiciary, which has video conferencing and transcription and cutting edge technologies embedded in it. And we need to start cultivating a new social culture in society for people volunteering and fundraising for causes as a habit and not something as, as an exception during extreme times. So this is the time to start something new every day, like move towards our dreams, the world that we always wanted to live in. But yeah, we got to start walking towards that now.
What is very clear is that we need to start, very mindfully start connecting the dots. There is a bigger picture that is emerging from this. It's not, the COVID is a manifestation. It's a sign of deeper melee. And I think that we need to now look at the dots, all the dots. And so across economic, social, economic, across various stakeholders, private, public, NGOs, state. That's one thing that I really think is very, very, and that's the transformation that all of us are looking for, but also and questioning everything really. And this is we are all sitting at home, and so we have enough time to imagine and enough reason to imagine because this is about survival. I think the other thing that is important is to bring back the conversation about the role of state. The fact that there has to be a core minimum of obligations that are recognized already, but which we have completely lost hope on. We no longer talk about core minimum obligations. All our services are getting privatized in the name of efficiency or in the name of God knows what. But I think that is something that we need to call out. I think the state has to start being the entire shrinking of state is something that had been happening all through, and that we now have to address strongly. And I think that as lawyers and as professionals, we need to step out of our comfort zones and start being more, I start looking at, our work in a collaborative, multi-stakeholder framing of our work.
That was amazingly said. I must say and confess that in between, this conversation made me extremely sad. It brought to the surface a lot of those hidden issues that we don't really get from the newspapers and, from the CNN, BBC, and all these reports online. And I'm glad that we had this conversation, and I'm very much appreciating that we are addressing them, tackling them, focusing on them as well. But altogether being said, I mean, towards the end, not that we are becoming more optimistic, but maybe even realistic. This is a reset, and we do have an opportunity, and I'm very glad that we have been brought together.
And we are all so diverse, we are all so diverse actually, and yet we can think together. Isn't that beautiful?
It is.
Not a lawyer. I'm a creative person, but I appreciated so much what you said about lawyers having to become more multidisciplinary. I'm seeing the same thing happening too with activists, not lawyers, but like academic type activists, and because they've just been focused so much on the research and on that level of organizing, and not on perhaps knowing how to frame communications and the creative aspects of the communications. And yes, a lot of people are realizing I have to become self-sufficient more, just like a lot of localized communities and small states are realizing I have to diversify and be able to do multiple things. I can't, it's calling all of us to expand our skill set and build our capacity. And
the worst thing that will happen is that we go back to the normal, or what people are saying new normal. I think that normal and new normal both are really scary words for me, because I think that we are just thinking of tinkering,
Yeah.
And we are also constantly interrogating ourselves. And I think this will end when we have interrogated enough, And so we are being made to reflect, and unless we reflect deeply enough, this is not going to go away. We need to really go, deep within, into the deep recesses of our, ourselves. And look at how we change ourselves, and that is very hard. It is very hard. I mean, if today I have to go back to university and start teaching, I will be driving the car. I will be I mean, that driving the car itself is such a horrible thing, and the sky will again become gray from blue. So you should see how Delhi looks today.
That's what we should have asked that. The taping is still going. Yeah, what is the view on the ground from Delhi?
Oh, meaning in terms of how Delhi looks?
Yeah, the nature and ecological response.
I will send you pictures. We have never had a bluer sky.
Wow.
The sky is absolutely delightfully blue, So I was reading, Chris Stone has written a paper, where he says, it's a very interesting paper I'd read some years back, where he says that maybe, who says that blue sky is beautiful? He says, what if the generation 100 years from now will say that gray sky is beautiful, And I was so troubled by it, I just said, oh my God, and so I said, by 100 years, we're already there. We've forgotten that sky looks blue, And now it's at least, so there is hope. Within a few weeks of, being at home, we managed to, we managed to repair the ozone layer hole. You saw that? Yeah. The largest hole in the ozone layer has been repaired.
Yeah. Which, you know what? I was reflecting on something a few days ago that, there's been so much movement all over the world, a lot of resources and political will at the global and national levels to deal with climate change. and everyone is saying that was the number one issue facing us, and we all have to get behind climate change and all of that. And of course, I mean, I supported it, dealing with social procurement and all of that. But emotionally, I never felt a connection to the climate change movement. That's emotionally. But professionally, I was aligned and I did what I had to do. COVID has happened, and you know what, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, you see, what COVID is showing us is the earth will take care of itself at any cost. It's not, we need to focus on us, but the issues that activists were working on from before, relating to social justice, inequality in society, all these things that you've been working on, a lot of us have been emotionally connected to, because it's actually linked to the suffering of human beings. COVID is showing us those are the issues that we need to make a priority, because solidarity is now important. COVID is attacking both rich and poor. And if we don't take care of the poor, the rich are going to get it. And so now, I mean, it's really a beautiful opportunity to reset. Just as you were talking about, I love how you put this, we need to mindfully start connecting the dots, looking at the dots, because it's symptoms that are showing us of a deeper response. It reminds me of something Fritjof Capra has said, that COVID, he's put out some lectures on COVID as well. And he said that he sees COVID as Gaia's response, as a biological response to the social and cultural and economic inequalities and yeah, that existed. And it's really yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. The earth will take care of itself.
And it's there to force us out of that false dichotomy that Shruti was talking about. We have to choose either this oppressive socialism, or we have to choose this exploitative capitalism. There are obviously other options, many other options than those two. And I look forward to perhaps in the near future us arriving at that place.
And you know what I love about this conversation? What Shruti did in this conversation was, I mean, I was approaching this conversation from the perspective of, yes, let's hear what India is doing on the ground. I want to understand the policy responses. I want to understand the human rights issues and all of that. And Shruti, what you did is you brought that rich underpinning, moving from thinking about the symptoms and thinking about how do we address what's happening, to the deeper things that are at play about who we are as human beings. And you know, and I love that, and I really appreciate you bringing that into the conversation, because it's something that we have been talking and reflecting on, but we didn't necessarily bring it into these conversations, you know. And so you
so much. I'm glad it added value, because this is something that I have been thinking and talking and writing about, you know, the fact that every time we are pitting, you know, we are kind of fragmenting our own thinking. We are working in silos. We are, you know, we're getting caught in small details, small pockets, and not looking at the big picture. And this corona is, you know, this is COVID-19. It will happen again. Because I learned the science of this. Corona is a kind of virus, and this is a virus that has, I mean, earlier we had that Nipah and whatever those were. They were also coronaviruses. So as this is the UNEP chief has warned, Ingrid somebody, her name is the UNEP chief. She said that, you know, this is going to happen more and more, because human beings are encroaching on the territories of animals, wildlife. We are, you know, this is classic what is called Anthropocene.
Yes.
You know, we have become the owners of the earth.
That's right.
What else is this? Is classic Anthropocene.
Yeah.
If
it's
you know,
negative feedback, it's negative biofeedback.
Negative.
But we can definitely tackle it. I've just watched a series of Netflix. Yes, it is zoonotic virus. It comes from a bat or whichever animal it was. But the fact is that if we actually have the correct response system in place, then we can at least limit it to a certain extent. So, it happened in Wuhan. If they would react 2 weeks earlier, it might actually be contained and limited to one country alone. So it wouldn't have this type of spread as we are observing it today. And it's almost impossible to stop it. But in fact, we're not really stopping it. We are onboarded in this evolution, let's say, and the evolution is not just biological, it definitely is the systemic and political and legal and from so many different perspectives.
I hope that we can see through some of the problems, solutions for some of the problems that we've discussed today, and get more and more of us together and under one umbrella. I've been speaking about the project with some of my other folks in Delhi, and everybody feels that this is really important. This is the good fight, and I'm very grateful that you decided to start it, that you decided to take it on, and you're very courageous. I must say that for someone who has like no institution backing, no brand, you guys have just gone on and made a website, and you've been like at it. You've been organizing sprints so regularly. It takes a lot. You've been very patient with me and some of my other friends who come in and go out. Like Shruti says, I attend multiple Zoom calls within the sprint. Must have seen that. I keep logging in, logging out all the time. But, and you've been very patient with us going through our experiments and our learnings. So hats off to you. And I hope that that each one of us who's a part of this project is able to deliver on time and come out with some kind of a knowledge bank that will serve the global academia and policy community for years to come, maybe decades to come. So thank you. This is massive, and I'm very proud to be a part of this. So before I sign off,
finally, I have come to a point which is making meaning, out of it. Which is now being talked about as the 6th stage of grief, where you are trying to see what meaning does this hold. And I think that there is a huge possibility that I can see that this crisis is carrying for us. It is, and so I was actually reading Roberto Unger, and in that, while I was reading his book, I also looked up a talk which is on the YouTube, which is called something about the false necessity, illusion of false necessity, where he ends his talk by saying that that hope is not a condition for action. That we don't have to wait for the hopeful circumstances that create hope for us to take action. He says hope is actually the result, the consequence of action. And I think that really gave me a lot of it gave me a lot of sense of power, and I hold on to that today. Thank you.
Thank you so
We have to
much.
create hope. We have to create hope for ourselves and for other people.
We have to create hope. Yeah. Absolutely. And what we are doing is one such small step. So,
what a beautiful thought.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you both for bearing with us and
all
for
of
taking
you,
the
lovely
time.
meeting you. Really lovely meeting you.